Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at just 2 pages in the discovery documents, page 443 and 444. And what we're going to do on those pages is we're going to go through the text messages provided by Cody Roberts to CBI agent Stacey Galbraith. That was when she interviewed the Anadarko Petroleum employee Cody Roberts in the lobby interview room of the Frederick Police Department. So even if Chris Watts had gotten rid of all his messages on his phone, the problem was that there were artifacts on a lot of other people's phones, and if the law enforcement followed up, you would eventually put all these fragments together and get a really good idea what is going on. The same applies to Shannan Watts. Even if Watts managed to, let's say, had access to the cloud, that they shared the iCloud, and he managed to delete some of her texts, the person on the other side would still have had them, like Addie Maloney, Christina Meacham, Nicole Atkinson, and so on. And so he was only getting rid of one half of the equation, if he was able to do that. So in this episode, we're just going to go through the text that he sent to his co-worker, Cody Roberts, and we're going to look at those texts, and we're going to look to an extent at whether this behavior on the Monday was unusual from his co-worker's perspective. Okay? Before we get to that, I am going to be putting up a timeline on the Amanda Knox case. The 2nd of November is the 13-year anniversary of the murder of Meredith Kircher. So we're just going to look at the timeline leading up to that fairly briefly. Now, before we get to today's episode, please subscribe if you haven't already. You can click the icon on the bottom right, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So the issue we are grappling with when we're dealing with premeditation is at what point did Watts sort of make up his mind, resolve, deliberate, premeditate, decide, coolly calculate what he was going to do. And we're going to get some idea from these texts between himself and Cody Roberts. As I said, it's on Discovery page 443 and 444. And we're going to look at the text from Sunday, the 12th of August. And this was immediately after he arrived back from the birthday party. So literally something like 36 minutes after he left, around about, say, half an hour after he left, he was planning the access to the disposal site. So he'd already decided he was going to murder his family, and what this was about was where could he hide their bodies, right? And this was part of the premeditation. Now, what I want to put into your minds, and we'll talk about it again at the end of this episode, is from a criminal psychology perspective, if Chris Watts was trying to commit his crime in as effective a way as he could, what would make more sense? To kill his children? And I know it's grotesque even to talk this way, but just from a criminal psychology perspective, imagine you are law enforcement and you are trying to read Chris Watts' mind. You're trying to figure out what was he thinking. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to follow the path of his thoughts, right? And so the question is, what would make more sense for him, to kill his children first and then Shannan, or Shannan first and then the children? Now, just in a very global way, if you think about a scenario where he killed Shannan first, but she arrived second. So he has the children in his custody, and they are young children. They're not like teenagers or something. He's got very young children in his custody. They've got an early bedtime. Does he want to leave their murders until after Shannan has died? Now, the issue here is whoever he murders first, there's a possibility of discovery from the remaining victims before they are done away with. Does that make sense? So in other words, what is worse? The children being up and running when their mother has died, and bear in mind there are two children, or the mother being alive when the two children have died. Now, there are a couple of ways of looking at it, but one of the ways is he already has the children in his custody. He's already decided what it's going to do, right? The other aspect, I guess, is if he kills his children and there's some first, and there's some issue, and that his wife doesn't return, or that someone comes in the house with her, all of these things could backfire. And so you've got to think about that in that respect as well. But we're going to, after going through these premeditation texts, we're going to look at that question again. Would it have made sense to have allowed the children to just be asleep at night if he was going to murder Shannan that night? Or would it have made sense to have just forgetting everything? Or would it have made sense to do something else? So we start off with the first text at 1706, and this is quite early in the afternoon. And obviously what we're doing is we're looking at these texts in isolation. We're not looking at them in context to all the other texts that were sent that day from Shannan to Nicole Kessinger, from Nicole Kessinger, and everything else, his communication with all the different people that he communicated with. This is we're just looking at it in terms of Watts and Roberts. I'm going to do a follow-up video to this one showing the text that was sent between Kessinger and her friend. So you had kind of a interesting scenario where Watts and Roberts were communicating, where Watts was doing this in order to create a scenario favorable for himself, he thought, and Kessinger, whereas at the same time, not the same time, but the same day, more or less the same time, just a bit early in the afternoon, Kessinger was texting her friend about this guy that she'd met at work. And so we're going to see them in isolation, but we're also juxtaposing them side by side, just in terms of the one video and the next. So anyway, at 1706, he says, I have whip checks for the Service 629. So he starts off talking about Service 629. I'm going to go straight out there from my house in the morning. I will look at 319 as well as run the 1129 if you want. And so what he's doing here by mentioning these three, and bear in mind, he mentions 319 kind of in the middle. He doesn't mention it first, even though he would end up going there first. But he mentions all three of them, and the idea is that he is now laying down a record for his intentions, and he knows it. I mean, the fact that he's hidden away his cell phone messages and the hiding away of the Ring doorbell, not the hiding away, but turning it off so it wouldn't be on. He's very aware of the digital breadcrumbs he's leaving behind. And so what he's doing here is he's hiding the actual well site that he means to go to in the sort of safety of numbers, if you can put it that way. The well site that he's interested in is this one, and he knows this is the one that he's targeting. So he's basically communicating to Cody Roberts, I'm going to go straight out to the wells the next morning, right? And he's saying, I'm going to look at this well and that one if you want. And then Roberts responds 14 minutes later, right? Quite a long time later, he responds, I was going to head out there first thing tomorrow to check out the 319. That is the one that he highlights himself. Although Watts has mentioned these three, Cody Roberts, out of his own, says, I was going to head out there first thing tomorrow to check out 319, right? And then he says, did Troy talk to you about what I'd found there Friday afternoon? And the answer is yes. So all weekend, Chris Watts has actually known about the issues with 319, and that is why I say he's got 319 on his mind, right? He's got 319 on his mind, not the other wells. I'm talking about in terms of the disposal. He's probably already decided what he's going to do. Now he's got to decide what comes after that. How he's going to cover his tracks, okay? At 17:22, Watts responds, so just 2 minutes after Roberts, yep, I was standing right next to him, LOL. And that's true. I think he was at a Safeway parking lot. I think he was driving around the children in the Lexus, and he gave him he got a fire stick from Troy McCoy. And Watts actually took that day off work, and then he met Troy McCoy kind of in this parking lot. And that's when I think he overheard Troy talking to Cody Roberts. Now, what I established in the previous video dealing with the number 2 major thing missing, it's somewhere sort of in that video. I think it's nearer to the end. I was talking about the moment that Chris Watts decided, where he realized he's going to have to do what he's going to do, and it happened on the 8th of August. It was something that happened between him and Kessinger that made him realize this. So you can go and watch that video. If you don't want to watch the whole thing, watch the last half hour. But that's quite a crucial part of the narrative. And that was when he realized it. And so it was 2 days later, essentially, the 8th, the 9th, from the 8th to the 10th, where he realized, okay, I know I've got to do this. And then he realized, 319, there's an issue there. And then 2 days later, he's still leaving things to the last moment, but this is him now making final arrangements. Having sat with the idea of the murder for 4 days, and now the idea of the disposal for, I guess, 2 days. And so he says, to reinforce why he was there, he said, I was giving him a fire stick to look at. I'm not sure whether he received one or whether he was giving him one to, I don't know. Anyway, so that is what he says. And then a minute after that, so in short shrift, he sends 3 texts. So he's in quite a hurry to communicate here. And he says, I can go there though. No sense in both of us going there, LOL, right? So here he's pretending to be nonchalant. It's not a big deal, and it's nothing for Cody Roberts to be concerned about. And of course it is, but he's trying to sort of come across nonchalant. That's what these LOLs are. There are 2 LOLs in the 3 texts, and of course there's nothing to laugh about here. What is going on here is deadly serious. The result of this conversation is going to determine whether the family lives or dies. Now, the interesting thing to contemplate, and I guess it's also quite a grisly thought, is if Cody Roberts said, don't worry, we actually sorted out the well late on Friday. There's no reason for any of us to go out there. What would Watts have done? Would he have come up with a plan B or C? Did he have an alternative to what he meant to do? Roberts, now this is quite a long time later. Now, can you imagine if Roberts had just sort of turned on the television and just kind of got sidetracked watching something, a sports game or something, and just didn't get back to Watts? What would have happened then? But as fate decided, I guess is the word, as fate determined, around about 50 minutes later, Roberts texted back, and this was the fateful text. He said, "All right, sounds good, man. I appreciate it." So Watts didn't need to go out there. Roberts was already going out there. Watts wanted to go out there. Watts needed to go out there. And Watts thought he could do what he intended to do at that particular well site. There were 2 tanks. It was remote. And it would also afford him the opportunity to be there on his own early in the morning. Right? And then he says, I think I still have a couple of conies left out there. I can let you know in the morning, and let me know if you find anything at the 319. So here Roberts is essentially handing over 319 to Watts. He's saying, okay, I'm not going to go there, you can go there. And then he says, we may pressure test that BP line. I'm not quite sure what BP stands for. But he says if it's leaking underground, and I think it was leaking underground. Now, the fact that that well was leaking may have made the instruments that were showing the various readings and levels, may have made them kind of dodgy, which meant if you put a body in there, it wasn't going to necessarily register that something strange was happening, if that makes sense. So in other words, remotely, I guess there's a control room at Anadarko that can show them, okay, so this well has got that much capacity left, and this is the situation. But when there's a leak, I think the readings kind of go a bit haywire. And in that fuzzy data, Watts thought that he could sort of dispose of the bodies, and it wouldn't necessarily show up as an anomaly. 3 minutes later, cool as a cucumber, Watts basically kind of secures the deal, secures his access to the well site. Copy that, right? And that is the last time that he talks to him that night. So the conversation starts just after 5 and it ends shortly after 6. So after an hour of texting, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 texts from Watts and just 2 from Roberts, the situation at Survey 319 is finalized, right? And I'm not going to deal with this now, but the question is, what then happened after 8:12? What happened after 8:12 at the Watts home? As I said, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but broadly speaking, he then barbecued. He sort of took out 4 chicken breasts, I think, and barbecued, and he was seen, and no one else was seen while he was barbecuing. He did FaceTime with Shannan's parents so that they could see the children, and oddly enough, they only saw the one child, although they seemed to be aware that the other child was also there. And I think that went on for about 12 minutes, and then nothing. And then I think it was about an hour and a half later, Shannan asked him to send photos of her children sleeping in bed. She wanted to know where they were, and he said that they were in bed. And I think he may have said something like, Bella's just gotten back into bed or something. And then she said, well, they must be exhausted, from the birthday party. And then she wanted photos showing them in bed, and he didn't send them to her. And this isn't the kind of guy Watts is. He doesn't just not do as Shannan says. And so he does send her pictures, but he just doesn't send them of them sleeping. He sends pictures from early in the day. And unfortunately, Shannan doesn't question him on that. If Shannan had insisted, okay, thanks for sending me those photos, I think he sent the same photos he'd sent earlier again, and then one additional photo he hadn't sent, but also from the birthday party again. If Shannan had insisted and said, no, please, I just want to, I'm really worried about the girls, please send it to me, what would he have done? And of course, it's easy to say in hindsight, Shannan didn't think of that In fact, she was trying to cut Watts some slack. Unfortunately, at the wrong time for them. Then we go to Monday at 06:31. So again, it's him opening up communication. He wants to know where is Cody Roberts, right? And as far as I remember, this was the time he arrived at the well site based on the GPS data. He just arrived, right? And I seem to also remember that he said he was somewhere when he wasn't, when he was still 20 minutes out. But regardless of that, he's the one who opens up the communication. And it's very important that he knows where his colleague is, because he's playing a very dangerous game here. He's got 3 bodies with him in the car, or 2 or 1, but ultimately he's going to have to dispose of 3 corpses, and he needs to know that the coast is clear. It's quite a huge gamble. It's quite brazen. But of course it is early in the morning, and there's only one guy out there right then, and it's Cody Roberts. And all he's got to do is go to Survey 319 when Roberts is somewhere else. And so just a minute later, he gets word that the coast is clear. Where is his colleague? In Kersey. And that's some distance away from Roggan, and it's some distance away from Survey. And if he went from there straight to Survey 319, it would take some time going over those dirt roads, and that was what made that well site attractive. It was quite difficult to access. It wasn't necessarily that far away from anywhere, but you had to go through a little bit of a labyrinth of roads within the Survey Ranch to get to them, and you had to open and close gates as well. Just a minute later, after Roberts' response, Watt says, "Okay, I'm in Survey," right? And if you look at the GPS data, Watts does arrive at Survey at 6:53. He leaves his home at 5:46. So it's a 107-minute trip out there, 67 minutes. And it is true that he does lie about him being there when he's not there, which shows that he was running late. He meant to be there at exactly 6:30, and he was running late. And you can kind of imagine that if he didn't do that, his colleague might have thought, because he has now told his colleague, "Don't worry, I'm going to be there first thing in the morning, I'll sort it out." But the fact is he's running late, but he's now going to pretend he's not running late, and all he does is he says he's there when he's not there. And you've got to ask a couple of questions here. Why is he running late? One possibility is that he had difficulty with Shannan because she arrived home delayed. But another possibility is that he had a difficulty remember, he's just murdered 3 people. And maybe there was a difficulty with one of them or 2 of them, where something that he didn't anticipate. Something to think about. Anyway, while he's, I guess, still on the road, he says, "Where are you going first?" And they're actually not supposed to text while they're driving, and I'm pretty sure he was. So he wants to know, where are you going to go? Are you going to come to Survey 319? And so he answers, DPC state. I don't actually know what that means. But whatever it means, Chris Watts says, sends a thumbs up, which basically is also a thumbs up for him. That is, it's giving him the go ahead that he can do what he needs to do, right? So at 06:35, just get my audio back here. At 06:35, he says, "I need to call Chad and see if plans on still stroking the 1029 out there to see if it'll pump up." Okay, and so at 6:35, Watts answers him and says, okay, let me know before I leave here, and bear in mind he still hasn't arrived. He will arrive at 6:53. And then Roberts says, I think he might be heading out there today, meaning Chad McNeil. And then he says phone was breaking up pretty bad. And notice how Watts just doesn't respond. Watts is possibly because there was no cell phone reception, but at 6:59, look how between 6:38 and 6:59, there's just no response from Watts. Do you see that? And maybe that also played into why it chose Survey 319, is because the cell phone service is so patchy there. If someone was going to try and trace his phone and track his phone, it wouldn't necessarily pick it up. So it's at 6:53 that he arrives there, and then at 6:59 Roberts is texting him, and just Watts doesn't answer for quite a long time. So it's at this point that Watts is obviously scrambling to deal with the bodies that he has in his truck as fast as he can. And look at that, essentially 10 minutes go by. And the fact that he does reply certainly shows that he does have some kind of reception there, right? I think he did tell Coda that he wouldn't call from the well site because the reception, if you made a call, wasn't good, but you could text. I don't know if that's true, but it does seem to be true. So now we're on Discovery page 444, and Watts is at the well site. He's been there for about 17 minutes, and I believe when he sent this text, he'd already buried Shannan. In other words, he'd parked very near where he was going to bury her, and because she was kind of a fairly big body in his truck, he wanted to get rid of her first. The children were smaller bodies that he could kind of cover up if he really had to. But he needed to get rid of her first, and it was going to take the longest to dig her grave. And so I believe he did that first. And so that could explain the 17 minutes of silence. And obviously the silence continues for another 31 minutes. Roberts says, I'm here at 10 to 9, Survey 10 to 9, do you mind coming out here? And Watts responds just 2 minutes later, well, I'm at 319 1 sec. So whatever he needed to do by 7:43, he was able to look at his phone quite quickly because he was sort of done. And so between 7:10 and 7:41, it's also possible he dug the grave then, but I think after 7:10 he would have gotten the girls' bodies through the hatches one by one, and also checked to see if the coast was clear from the top of those hatches. Bear in mind, if he was at the top of one of those hatches early in the morning, he could see someone coming from a distance. But of course, if he was digging the grave late in the morning, he couldn't see someone coming from a distance. So it would make sense to do the work where he didn't have much line of sight and would take a long time. But because it was earlier, he had a better chance of getting away with it. Do that first, and then do the sort of riskier work late in the morning, but where you would have a view of anyone coming along. Now, it's possible that these messages from Roberts distracted him sufficiently that maybe if he was about to collect the bed sheet, the fitted sheet, and he got a text from Roberts texting him back, caused him to lose his concentration. Does that make sense? Or while he was texting, a gust came up and blew away the sheet, or just moved it slightly, that it was now out of his peripheral vision. Does that make sense? And now we go to 7:43. Roberts asked, how does it look? How does the situation look at survey 319? And now Watts he's got to pretend he's working. He's there saying that he's working. And what has he been doing? He's been running around burying people, but now he's got to do some actual work. And so he does take a photo of the leak, and he sends it to his colleagues. And so he's trying to juggle. He's trying to make it look like plausible deniability. Roberts asked, is it a lot? In other words, is there a lot that is leaking? And Watts then sends a photo of pipes into the ground with an apparent leak. And that's sort of 2 minutes later. So probably what he did there was to prove that he's there, and to prove that he's on the job, he sends the photo. He doesn't just answer. Now, what's quite interesting here is, Roberts wants to know what's going on, and so what Watts does is he sends a photo. That's exactly what he didn't do with Shaw in bed. Does that make sense? And then 2 minutes later, Roberts says, want me to bring some gator? We can try and pressure test the line too if you want. And I think Watts does want to pressure test the line. And so we are now at around about an hour and 2 minutes. Watts has been at the well site for an hour and 1 or 2 minutes. And Roberts wants to join him. And so he says, no. He answers like 5 minutes later, don't worry, I've got it handled. In other words, don't come out here yet. So I think he's still kind of got work to do at this point. He doesn't want him to come out there. He's sort of done quite a lot of the grave work, but he hasn't done much of the work that he needs to do. And so he needs to do that before his colleagues arrive. He probably also wants to pressure test the line. I'm not sure whether he needs a colleague there to do it, but perhaps he wants to do a pressure test with no one there to get rid of evidence. But I've got an idea that they do need to be more than one person present, just because that is when they pressure tested it. I could be wrong. Then just additional information. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Roberts did not know that Survey 629 needed whip checks. Roberts provided that no one really likes going out there to survey as it is so far. So the guys don't really like going out there. So Watts saying he would go out there was like doing them a favor. He said if Watts would not have gone to survey, he would have gone to the office. Watts would have gone to the office. And that is what he normally would do. Roberts did not know the last time Watts may have been out to survey ranch. That's quite interesting. So it had been some time since he'd actually been out there. Roberts estimated that Watts spends 95% of his time in the field and 5% in the office. And that 5% in the office is where he would encounter Kessinger. He would spend 1 to 2 hours in the platform office in the mornings. So I think that's a bit of a misleading stat. If you spend 1 to 2 hours in the office in the mornings and the rest of the time not there, and you've got a sort of a 9-hour workday, I mean, that's more like 10 to 20%, isn't it? Anyway, Watts was previously a rover and is now a lead and works all over the place, but still basically kind of at the lower level of the Anadarko hierarchy. Chad McNeil and Melissa Parrish were at 10 to 9. Watts was at 6 to 9, but they were actually also at 319. When Watts is there at 0630 hours, like he told Roberts, no one but Watts would have been there. And that's exactly what he wanted. While my voice is going a little bit, that's exactly what he wanted. He wanted to be there on his own to do this sort of dirty work that he was doing. Troy McCoy, Chad McNeil and Melissa Parrish would have been the first ones to see Watts on Monday. It's unknown the exact order they all arrived. And Melissa Parrish has got a very interesting story about what happened when she saw Chris Watts. Interestingly, all of the named employees were in separate vehicles, so every time an additional employee arrived, it would be a vehicle arriving. You'd also be able to tell a vehicle's arriving theoretically before you heard it. You'd see the dust plume. So from a long distance away, you might be aware there's a dust plume. A dust plume wouldn't necessarily mean it was coming to you. It might just mean that the vehicle was passing. And so there might be a couple of false alarms as well. Roberts, okay, I'm not really going to go further than this, but I'm not going to take it. So if you want to hear about the story from Melissa Parrish, let me know. But otherwise, I will be back tomorrow on the anniversary of the murder of Meredith Kurtz. It's a really tragic story when you know it in detail. And we're going to look at the context between the living arrangements, the friendship, the relationship as housemates, as sort of expat tourists, both of them, the one from Britain, the other one from America, what it was like living together in the run-up to poor Meredith's death on the 1st of November 2007, 13 years ago tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys next time.